It began not with discovery, but with error, a faint echo in a telescope log, a reading that refused to match prediction. Somewhere in the silence between two observation windows, the object entered the frame. No one was looking for it. Yet there it was, a flicker on the edge of calibration, a small light moving against the field of stars, too fast, too distant, too quiet. They called it 3I Atlas, an interstellar wanderer, the third of its kind after Oumuamua Amu-R and 2I Borisov, a messenger from the deep between suns. Its orbit was hyperbolic, meaning it would never return. Trajectory cut across the solar plane like a scar, clean and irreversible. The telescopes tracked its path, measuring light curves, velocity, eccentricity, the details of motion that tell a story older than language. At first it seemed simple, a comet from the Oort cloud perhaps, yet its speed said otherwise, 30 kilometers per second faster than anything bound by the sun. The light it gave was wrong, too reflective, too flat, no sign of coma or dust, no plume of ice, only a silent mirror gliding through black. Data flowed through servers in Hawaii, Chile, and Arizona, rows of numbers forming a pattern that felt almost deliberate. Scientists compared it to Oumuamua, the first visitor, and to 2I Borisov, the second, yet 3I Atlas behaved like neither. It tumbled, then it steadied, as if adjusting, as if aware. Its albedo shifted in microbursts, flashes not random, but rhythmic, too faint to decode, too consistent to dismiss. For weeks they argued over error margins, instrumental bias, and the subtle deceit of light. But in the background a quiet realization began to grow, that perhaps this was not an object behaving, but something performing. Every rotation revealed fracture lines across its surface, pale bands of reflected sunlight that split and rejoined like veins of glass. Spectral scans showed trace metals inconsistent with natural formation, titanium, silicon, fragments of carbon lattice that should not have survived the interstellar cold. And then, as the data accumulated, a new anomaly appeared. The object began to fade, not in brightness but in coherence. Its reflected spectrum broke into fragments, multiple signatures overlapping, as if the object itself were dividing. On March 12th, telescopes in Chile recorded the first split, a sudden release of material. No explosion, no outgassing, just a silent parting in vacuum, two halves drifting apart like cells dividing under an unseen force. It should have been violent, yet it was graceful, controlled. The fragments moved in perfect symmetry for the 12 hours before separating into a cloud of smaller bodies. Analysts called it disintegration, but the word failed to hold meaning, because the fragments retained alignment, as if some hidden geometry held them in place. NASA issued a brief statement, standard phrasing, comet fragmentation, no unusual findings, observation continues, yet the raw data files vanished from public archive within the day. Researchers in Europe noticed file gaps, missing timestamps, spectral anomalies logged then redacted. It was not the first time science folded into secrecy, but it was the most quiet. By the time public reports resumed, 3I Atlas was already gone, its path lost beyond the orbit of Mars, its debris scattering through sunlight like a memory refusing to fade. Still, the question lingered. Why did it break apart? And why did it move as if guided before it did? Some said heat stress, others said spin. Some whispered artificial control. In the labs, silence replaced certainty, because every theory required a cause that did not exist. Every explanation felt smaller than the data itself. It was less an arrival, more an exile written across the stars, a story too deliberate to be chant, too fragile to be design. If it was a visitor, it came not to reveal but to erase, to scatter what it once was into the language of dust. The scientists called it a failure of structure, but structure is only what we can measure, and meaning is what remains when measurement ends. As the last signals faded, one question began to surface across the teams. Could something have been watching us through that fracture? Or was the fracture itself the watching? It was the silence that unsettled most, not the data, but the absence within it, a void shaped like intention. And so, in the quiet corridors of observatories, they turned again to analysis, to spectra, to math, to every form of certainty that could silence doubt. Because when mystery appears in the night sky, Science is the only language brave enough to ask what has begun. At 02:14 UTC, the first clean trace registered on the array, a thin rise in magnitude against the background field. The weather over Mauna Kea held steady. The seeing was kind, the instruments were calm, the sky gave nothing away. A second trace followed 8 minutes later. Brighter by a fraction, slope consistent with inbound motion, phase angle shifting as expected for a high-speed approach. The duty astronomer marked the point, adjusted tracking, and queried the pipeline for correlation. The system returned no match. The track did not belong to any catalogued comet, asteroid, or debris fragment. The database replied with silence. The object moved on a curve that was not a curve, a straight line in the projected frame, a signature of a distant body crossing the field with indifferent speed. By dawn, the pre-solution fit came together. Eccentricity near 1.89, inclination steep, hyperbolic excess velocity significant beyond ordinary visitors. Bound bodies do not carry that kind of farewell. Unbound bodies do. The early model suggested a perihelion well inside the orbit of Earth, yet never captured by the sun. A cut through the plane and out again. A visit without return, and night teams in Chile picked up the thread, applied differential photometry and confirmed the same light curve irregularity. Small but stubborn. A modulation that refused to vanish under error bars. The signal did not show the textbook coma. The classic veil of volatile dust. There was only a sheen, a flat geometry of reflection. Spectral data remained thin, too early, too noisy, yet the absence itself had weight, a strange comfort and a quiet threat. The Minor Planet Center received the provisional designation request, then a revision, then a second revision with more precise astrometry. Every time the line sharpened, 3i Atlas, the third interstellar visitor, entered the language of the record with the plain force of numbers. Cometary candidates often stumble under scrutiny. This one did not stumble. It moved like a decision. Comparison to Oumuamua. Oumuamua began at once. Surface brightness, non-gravitational acceleration, aspect ratio inference. All the tired questions returned with new teeth. 2i Borisov had been friendly to interpretation, a comet through and through. This was not friendly. This was a mirror at speed. The phrase mirror at speed appeared in an internal email. Short, unamused, descriptive. Radar attempts failed. The geometry disliked our reach. The distance kept the object safe from our coarse touch. Photometry from Arizona tightened the scatter. The albedo estimates came out high, then conservative, then high again, as if the object could not decide which face to show. Rotation could account for some of it, but the Fourier analysis refused a clean period. The best fits were messy. The worst fit was intent. Scientists dislike that word, intent, but it hovers whenever data arranges itself into rhythm and resists causation. For the next cycle, the observatories agreed on a cadence, nightly coverage, overlapping windows, strict calibration, no heroics. The goal was simple: let the object speak in numbers and listen without adding our fear. On March 13th, the curve flattened, a paradox for a body closing distance. The explanation required geometry and reflection and a polite acceptance of surprise. The surface behaved like panels under changing illumination, not a claim, only a metaphor that felt near to the measurements. A faint thermal signal from the infrared bands teased itself into view, lower than expected for a volatile, rich surface, higher than a bare rock, a line that sat between. The models tried porous ice, then crusted dust, then sintered regolith, each with parameter sets stretched to their edges, each barely holding together. No gas lines stood out in the spectrum, no comfortable water signature, no obvious carbon dioxide bloom, perhaps too early, perhaps not there. Requests for additional time on large apertures went out with the quiet urgency of a community that senses a story forming. The first anomaly in the motion came as a whisper, a drift from the calculated ephemeris. Small, real, persistent across instruments, a push that had no apparent source. Solar pressure could own a fraction, outgassing could own a fraction, but the direction was off by a few clean degrees. Non-gravitational forces are legitimate when comets breathe. This one did not seem to breathe. The team documented the deviation, included the uncertainties, and kept a hard tone in their language. The tone that says, wait, elsewhere. A graduate student produced a visualization, fragmenting the light curve into the windows, stacking them, searching for patterns, a mild sin in the land of cautious analysis. The stack produced a faint rhythm, not stable, not enough to claim, enough to haunt. By the 14th, the world of amateurs felt the rumour. Small telescopes sniffed at the coordinates like curious animals. Some saw nothing. Some saw a glint. Most saw the limit of their optics. The official feed stayed clean. Numbers without adjectives, figures without myth, a discipline learned over centuries. Yet even in discipline, a narrative grows. A fact is a seed, and seeds do not ask permission to open. Control rooms hummed with the soft heat of machines. Human eyes turned the hum into meaning, the meaning into decision. Request more time, close the gap, protect the data from noise. Defense and civil agencies asked polite questions about tracking, possible hazard, possible interaction with satellites. The answers were calm and useful, the path was high and fast and safe. Safety did nothing to thin the wonder, because safety lives on a different axis than mystery. Past midnight, a quiet transmission arrived from a smaller facility. A thin line in their photometry hinted at a weak release event, not an explosion, not a bloom, only a peel, as if a layer of the surface decided to slide away from itself. The phrasing went into the log without poetry, surface shedding, likely, mass small, confidence low, monitor. Surface shedding is a normal line when ice meets heat. The sun is patient and thorough, but the timing put a pebble in the shoe of certainty. Too early, someone wrote, then deleted the words, then wrote them again with the numbers around them, because numbers offer mercy. The room accepted the pebble, collected more pebbles, and tried to call it a path. Paths require direction. The object gave only movement. A senior dynamicist set up a cluster of simulations, pushing spin rates, thermal gradients, voids under crust, tensile strength for brittle composites, all the respectable toys of reasonable minds. He watched the fragments of his models shear and wobble and fall back into spheres, because nature loves spheres when no one is watching. Only when he forced a symmetry into the initial state did he see the behaviour move toward the observations. Even then it wanted to heal, as if the math missed a ligament. He removed the ligament and the system flew apart in clumsy ways, not like the neat restraint of the nightly graphs. He wrote a note to himself, the kind of note that does not travel. Check at assumptions on radiative torque and subsurface architecture. Do not fall in love with explanations. Nothing ruins listening faster than the need to speak. Morning brought clarity and more questions, a refined orbit, cleaner residuals, and a growing wedge between prediction and reality, a wedge thin as a blade and just as honest. The coordination call stayed sober. No speculation, no drama. Assign tasks, review calibrations, schedule cross-checks, maintain public channels with care. The words careful and transparent appeared in the same sentence, a reminder that truth has temperature. Too hot and it warps, too cold and it cracks. A request for a radar window came back negative again. Geometry remained unkind, so the community doubled down on light, since light was all the object would give. A philosopher of science might say that we learn the most from what refuses to be known. The teams preferred to say nothing, just keep measuring. The silence is a method when used by steady hands. By the end of the week, the designation was formal and the story was not. A bright line in a ledger and a shadow in the mind. Reporters asked simple questions that deserved complex answers. The complex answers shrank on the way to the page. This is normal and always unsatisfying. Within the data there lived a promise, that cause would emerge from effect if we were patient, and that patience would survive the pull of wonder. In that patience, a thought began to take form. Perhaps fracture would come before comfort. Perhaps the object would explain itself by breaking. If that was true, the duty was clear. Watch with discipline. Do not blink when the sky decides to speak. Inside the last frame of the night, the telescope glass held a small tremoring shard of light, a reflection that seemed to quiver as if it remembered being whole. The sky above Mauna Kea bled a slow gold when the array turned west, and the last trace of night slipped off the instruments. Light from 3i Atlas had already crossed the Kuiper belt by then, carrying with it the memory of every dust grain it had disturbed. Photons reached Earth as history, 8 minutes old, each one a courier of what had once been. To follow that path was to look backward through a mirror that refused to lie. Data pipelines ran clean, every telescope feeding into the same silent grid of calibration, color correction, and normalization. The numbers did not argue, but they carried a hum, a shape beneath their obedience, a suggestion of a museum that analysts could feel more than see. In Hawaii they plotted brightness against time, in Chile they mapped polarization, in Arizona they measured the tail that never came. Across the network a single pattern began to whisper itself into existence, a modulation in flux that did not belong to dust or gas. When light curves refuse smoothness, astronomers call it personality. This one had personality and precision, a pulse inside reflection. At first the explanation stayed terrestrial: detector noise, atmospheric phase error, instrumental drift. Each excuse collapsed under the same test: cross-correlation between hemispheres. What trembled in one sky trembled in another, separated by 12,000 kilometers, synchronized within seconds. Light should not coordinate across oceans. The term photometric coherence appeared in a late-night report, tentative, italicized. It meant that the object was reflecting or emitting in a controlled way, but no one used the word control. Control invites narrative, and narrative ruins measurement. They preferred modulation, a safer word, clean and bloodless. Still, the curve rose and fell like breath under a blanket of numbers, and the teams felt the warmth of something not yet explained. In the spectral domain, the puzzle thickened. Infrared readings suggested low volatility, while visible bands showed a bright plateau inconsistent with expected scattering. If the surface was ice, it was too smooth. If it was rock, it was too bright. If it was dust, it was too deliberate. Models of mixed composition offered comfort but no clarity. A theoretical physicist proposed layered material, alternating dielectrics and metal traces, the kind of structure that engineers build, not stars. The idea stayed quiet, living between parentheses in a draft that would never be sent. Meanwhile, the orbital mechanics grew sharper. Each observation trimmed uncertainty until the trajectory looked less like chance and more like intent carved into space. Eccentricity 1.89 stayed constant. Perihelion distance confirmed. Exit vector unbound. 3i Atlas would never belong to the Sun. It would cut through gravity like a blade through thin fabric and vanish into interstellar dark again. That alone was beautiful enough. Yet beauty rarely travels alone. On a conference call half the planet apart, voices shared calibration files, tone neutral, hearts not. The tone always shifts when numbers start resembling sentences. One researcher mentioned albedo variation corresponding to rotation. Another mentioned that rotation itself seemed to shift, precession without reason. The words should have fallen cold, but they did not. They carried the heat of discovery and the ache of disbelief. Someone joked about a machine learning pattern hiding in the light. Laughter came late and careful. Outside the labs, the world slept under ordinary constellations. Inside, monitors glowed with false color renderings, lines of code looping over light like hands over ancient scripture. Every photon from the visitor was passed, counted, bent through algorithms, stripped of noise until only mystery remained. Science often feels like faith written in numbers, faith that truth will survive translation. They worked through the night, and when fatigue arrived it wore the shape of devotion. By morning, correlation matrices filled screens like constellations of logic. The coherence persisted across instruments, surviving randomization tests, resisting noise injections. It was not random, it was not stable, it was something in between, a behavior waiting to be named. The oldest astronomer on the call said softly, "Every light tells its own geometry. We just have to listen long enough." No one replied, but the silence was agreement. Late that day, a small adjustment in tracking revealed the object's path intersecting a background star, a brief occultation lasting less than a second. The data spike came and went, a momentary blink in the night, but the residual patterns after subtraction remained wrong. It suggested that the light from the star bent differently through the object's boundary, as if the surface carried a film, a lens of unknown index. The numbers were small, the implications large. To measure light is to measure truth, and truth bends only when asked by something it cannot see. The team logged the event, archived the raw files, and scheduled more passes. The object moved westward, sliding out of the field. leaving the detectors staring into a space now empty but still resonant. Screens dimmed, air cooled, and somewhere in the black between worlds, the path of light continued without them, a silent arc drawn through the infinite, indifferent to the eyes that followed. The first report of inconsistency came not from a telescope but from a server, a checksum mismatch in an archival packet at 0529 UTC. One data stream from the northern array diverged from its twin in the southern hemisphere, both observing the same object, both clean, both wrong in the same way. The timestamps aligned, the packet headers matched, but the intensity columns disagreed by a margin that no calibration could own, small enough to ignore, precise enough to disturb. Engineers retraced the data route, line by line through redundancy layers. Nothing broken, no error logs, no cosmic ray events. Cross-checks confirmed hardware integrity, only the photons disagreed. One dataset implied a spike, the other a dip, a mirror image of difference. If plotted together, the curves formed symmetry so exact that the anomaly itself looked designed. Symmetry is beauty until it refuses to explain itself. By mid-cycle, secondary archives showed the same pattern, a duality in brightness repeating every few rotations, perfect phase opposition between hemispheres. If the effect were atmospheric, it would smear. If instrumental, it would drift, but it stayed sharp as if drawn with intent. Analysts debated across midnight, running cross-correlations, removing outliers, subtracting noise until the noise began to resemble signal. Data scientists called it inversion coherence, a phrase invented to keep speculation away from the door. In spectral processing rooms, the hum of cooling fans merged with the low speech of sleepless precision. Someone suggested the object might possess two reflective regimes, hemispheric materials alternating under rotation, plausible, tidy, safe. The idea dissolved when new readings showed phase shift decoupled from rotation rate. It moved independently, like a secondary cycle nested within the first, the rhythm of an engine disguised as reflection. NASA's internal communication threads grew longer, the language careful, verbs subdued. Terms like possible telemetry contamination and unsynchronized integration entered the file. Phrases built to calm curiosity, external archives updated quietly, corrected values replacing originals without note. The older numbers were not deleted, only overwritten, as if truth could be versioned. One researcher kept a local copy under a new name, just in case meaning decided to vanish again. During calibration review, a pattern emerged across multiple facilities, identical anomalies recurring at precise orbital intervals, each separated by 71 minutes, each lasting 11 seconds. The odds of repetition that clean under random conditions were negligible. The period matched no known mechanical artifact, no telemetry schedule, no satellite interference. It existed where nothing should repeat, in the data itself. A system is defined by what it forgets, and this one remembered too well. Spectral decomposition showed the same bifurcation. Each fragment of light seemed to carry a twin, slightly delayed. Same wavelength, offset amplitude. Interference patterns appeared where none should be. Faint standing waves in the noise floor, self-referencing, recursive. It was as if the reflection contained an echo of itself, a recording built into its own surface. The word recording appeared once in a draft and was removed before submission. Elsewhere, machine learning pipelines meant to filter artifacts began highlighting fragments of the anomaly as features of interest. No one told the models what to look for. They simply found structure in chaos, and chaos began to look like design. A junior analyst proposed splitting the datasets entirely, treating the divergence as dual entities instead of corrupted halves. The idea was dismissed until one graph showed something impossible, both curves converging briefly into a single clean signal, unity before returning to opposition. Data cannot reconcile unless instructed to, yet here the numbers met like mirrors breathing. When the anomaly reached its 6th repetition, servers lagged, as if burdened by the symmetry they held. Compression algorithms failed to reduce redundancy, because redundancy itself had meaning. It was not random, it was recursive, each frame referencing the last, a loop written in light. At that point, the engineers stopped describing behavior and started describing philosophy. Someone said quietly, "Maybe the object is not fractured." "Maybe we are." No one answered. But in the logs a new comment appeared, unseen by review, a single line without sudden signature. The comment read, "Symmetry persists when observation divides," and with that, the record folded into itself, the data repeating into perfect stillness, as if the object had stopped moving and the instruments had begun. The memo arrived unsigned, an internal directive labelled Operational Update, Level 2 Clearance, immediate effect, distribution limited to data custodians and project leads, content brief, phrasing calm, tone colder than paper, effective midnight. All observational channels pertaining to Object 3i Atlas are to be rerouted through centralized encryption nodes. Temporary latency expected, security review pending, do not publicize delays. The instruction carried the weight of routine, the silence of precedent, systems obeyed, packets rerouted, archives locked for maintenance, log entries replaced by placeholders that spoke in generalities, transmission acknowledgement confirmed at 00:51 UTC, followed by a gap of 14 minutes where no telemetry reached downstream repositories. The gap was justified as synchronization, the preferred word for absence. At the facilities, the blackout felt procedural until it lingered. Analysts refreshed dashboards, saw greyed out fields, no errors, no red flags, only static completion icons. It was absence built to look like order. When channels resumed, several observation blocks were missing, their identifiers skipped as if they had never existed. Checksum counts still matched expected totals. The dataset had healed itself by forgetting. Independent observatories outside the network noticed discrepancies almost at once. A Russian facility reported missing intervals in time series logs. A Japanese archive noted irregular metadata tags inserted automatically by relay scripts. Each case shared the same pattern, absence polished into symmetry. It became impossible to prove loss because the architecture now believed in its own integrity. Integrity is the cleanest disguise for silence. Emails began to circulate quietly between teams, cautious phrases hidden in harmless syntax, questions disguised as acknowledgements. One message read simply, the timestamps hum, another replied, only when compared. The official review process moved forward, documented, transparent, concluding with one line of perfect closure, no evidence of unauthorized alteration. Transparency had become geometry, polished until it reflected nothing. Meanwhile, a backup facility in Australia caught a fragment of transmission during the blackout window, a sliver of data without header or checksum, spectral density compressed beyond recognition. When expanded, it showed faint harmonics clustered near frequencies used for spacecraft telemetry. Too faint to confirm, too close to coincidence to dismiss. The sample was archived under a neutral file name, not for secrecy, but for self-preservation. Some truths remain safer unnamed. Over the following nights, blackouts recurred, irregular but patterned, always between identical observation epochs, always lasting the same measured silence, as if absence had become a kind of communication. Scientists debated clock drift, relay noise, magnetic interference. None of those fit, but all of them comforted. Comfort is a tool in the house of doubts. In an internal symposium summary, one sentence appeared out of place and written in the style of an error code. It read, "Observe the absence, do not repair it. No one claimed authorship. The line survived edits, printed copies, revisions, existing quietly like a forgotten prayer folded into procedure." By the time global access returned to normal, nothing had changed on paper. Logs were complete, datasets whole, integrity metrics perfect. Only the people had altered, their confidence replaced by the slow awareness that data can lie by omission. They began to speak softly when discussing the gaps, as if silence could still hear them. Somewhere deep in the control system, the servers cooled, their hum no longer steady but uncertain, a tremor like breath beneath the noise. No alarm sounded, no errors reported. Just that tremor, steady, then fading, as if the machines had exhaled and forgotten what to inhale next. In science, fracture is a language. It speaks when continuity can no longer carry meaning. To study a break is to study the moment truth chooses to divide itself as. The data from 3i Atlas, still incomplete, still unresolved, had become a map of fractures, not of rock or ice, but of coherence, of patterns that could not remain whole. Analysts no longer asked why it had broken, but what the breaking had allowed them to see is every loss carried a gain, every silence a new contour of information. Thermal models suggested stress accumulation under asymmetric heating, a familiar explanation wrapped around an unfamiliar precision. Spin rate analysis showed instability thresholds exceeded days before the final split, yet no rotational acceleration could explain the symmetry of separation. Mechanical failure should be messy, but this was orderly. Fracture lines followed geometry, not chaos. They traced ratios of 2 to 3, of 3 to 5, like echoes of design hiding inside accident. At first, the teams resisted interpretation. Discipline demands disbelief until numbers corner doubt, but the numbers were cornering everything. The fragments had decayed into smaller pieces, yet the light distribution across each remained proportional, like fragments remembering the shape of what had held them. Fragment memory is not a recognized property in astrophysics, but the term began to circulate quietly in emails, half joke, half hypothesis. Spectral comparison of debris fields showed an odd persistence of alignment. Each cluster held orientation relative to the Sun, as if the object's structure retained its internal sense of direction after disintegration. Even after chaos, symmetry refused to die. Simulations failed to reproduce it unless a control variable existed, a self-adjusting parameter that no one could justify. They called it pseudo-stabilization, another phrase born from discomfort. The phenomenon obeyed rules but not origins. In a small note hidden inside a draft, one scientist wrote, "Fracture is intelligence unbound from intention. It was a poetic violation of technical language, but no one deleted it. The idea lingered in review documents, ghosting through citations like an unsanctioned thought. The more they measured, the more fracture resembled communication, not destruction. Each split carried data, encoded in motion, in brightness, in absence. The debris had become an alphabet of brokenness." Back on Earth, laboratories simulated stress propagation in artificial composites, applying controlled heat to samples of layered silicate and carbon. The samples cracked predictably, except when micropatterns in lattice orientation caused energy to dissipate in rhythm instead of rupture. The resulting fragments were uniform, harmonic. It was as if the material anticipated its own end and planned for beauty. Nature often creates elegance through indifference, but indifference rarely repeats with this much precision. Reports began to treat fracture as process, not event. Energy distribution maps resembled network diagrams, each piece connected by invisible relationships of force and memory. When visualized in motion, the debris field looked less like chaos and more like orchestration. Mathematicians began writing about symmetry persistence, philosophers about the language of disassembly. In deep space, collapse is not death, it is grammar. Every object eventually writes its final word by splittings. The deeper the analysis went, the quieter the conclusions became. Science could describe how fracture unfolds, but not why some fractures feel intentional. Intent belongs to the living, yet the pattern refused to behave as if it were dead. It balanced between explanation and implication, the place where certainty ends and narrative begins. In the end, what remained was not proof but a principle. Fracture is how systems tell the truth they cannot contain. When coherence fails, meaning escapes, and in that escape, reality briefly shows its structure before closing again. Every era of astronomy inherits one forbidden question, not whether life exists, but whether intention can be written into matter. In the silence after 3i Atlas fractured, that question began to hum beneath the noise of numbers. The object's geometry refused accident. Thermal maps showed panel-like structures in reflectivity, alternating brightness with intervals too clean for random surface evolution. Natural fragmentation produces chaos, but this one produced ratio. Every piece aligned in multiples, 2 to 3, 3 to 5, a sequence more musical than mechanical. When systems echo harmony, even skeptics feel the gravity of design. The idea surfaced gently in draft discussions, the way heresy always does. Born in footnotes and quiet parentheses, could 3i Atlas have been assembled, not formed? The distinction was linguistic but lethal, Assembly implies builder. Builder implies purpose. Purpose implies story. Science fears story because story eats data. Yet data was beginning to behave like narrative. Engineers reviewed the albedo pattern again, this time with algorithms trained on known artificial materials, composite mirrors, metallic films, layered ceramics. The machine returned correlations above baseline, weak but consistent. The result was not proof, it was invitation. The archives recorded a note in sterile phrasing, surface behavior consistent with engineered periodicity. No one signed it to. At Goddard, a small team built a synthetic model of the object using finite element simulation. They seeded it with parameters drawn from the observational fit, shape irregular but controlled, spin within range. When subjected to solar heating, the model held together longer than expected, then failed exactly along harmonic stress lines matching the real debris pattern. They ran it again, changed nothing. Same result. Design emerges when randomness repeats. In another building, a mathematician treated the debris as signal instead of object. He plotted fragment trajectories as wave functions and saw interference between their projected paths. The pattern resembled resonance more than explosion, a coherent distribution of failure. He described it as a device that sings itself apart. The phrase reached the review board, stripped of poetry, reduced to energy resonance event, non-natural configuration possible, the file closed without comment. A speculative memo leaked briefly through an academic preprint server before being withdrawn. It proposed that interstellar objects could be self-replicating structures designed to fracture intentionally, distributing micro-payloads or information fragments across space, each shard carrying encoded architecture, each orbit a syllable in a larger syntax of exploration. Critics called it science fiction in mathematical clothing, but the numbers did not blush. They remained still, like witnesses refusing denial. In a philosophical addendum, someone wrote that perhaps construction does not always require hands. Perhaps intention is an emergent property of geometry repeating itself. If the universe can teach matter to orbit, why not to organize? The idea was dismissed as poetic contamination, yet it lingered like background radiation, faint everywhere, unkillable. By the end of the review quarter, 3i Atlas had become both artifact and accident, a paradox no language could balance. Every explanation required choice, and choice had no place in physics. Still, silence began to feel chosen. The theory of constructed objects remained unofficial, whispered in corridors, never cited, never refuted. Its core was simple, almost innocent, the same shape every myth takes before it matures into belief. If an object can fracture with purpose, then purpose may survive the fracture. And if purpose survives, what remains of accident? Mathematics does not believe in coincidence. It only tolerates it until pattern arrives. When researchers mapped the fragment distribution of 3i Atlas, tolerance ended. Each shard carried a vector, a trace of velocity and orientation, angles catalogued across thousands of data points. When plotted in polar coordinates, the pattern did not diffuse as natural breakup demands. Instead, it converged into nested spirals, logarithmic, self-similar, ratios recurring with uncanny restraint. Entropy should scatter, not compose. The symmetry held under transformation. Convert spatial distribution into frequency domain, same rhythm. Compress motion data into Fourier series, same pulse, at every scale, repetition whispered, 2 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 8. The sequence was not Fibonacci, not golden, but something neighbouring both, like a dialect of mathematics invented elsewhere. A doctoral candidate ran the dataset through a shape recognition algorithm designed for planetary ring dynamics. The output returned classification error, then labelled the pattern as structural resonance artifact. The phrase made no sense, yet it lingered in every subsequent citation. Structures are built, not born, but resonance implies response, or... In a meeting transcript preserved without names, someone asked quietly, "What if this is not an object but a message in geometry?" The question earned silence, then cautious agreement disguised as correction. "Perhaps not message," one voice said. "Perhaps behaviour. Objects cannot behave," another replied. Then again, nothing else does this. Oh. Spectral analysis of fragment composition added more unease. Traces of nickel, silicon, and carbon compounds formed ratios too stable across samples separated by thousands of kilometers. Random distribution would vary by magnitude, yet here the deviation stayed within 1%. It was as if the fragments obeyed a recipe, ingredients measured, baked in symmetry. Natural physics dislikes recipes. Recipes belong to intention. The team built simulations to test mechanical plausibility. Each attempt to recreate the pattern through rotational stress, thermal gradient, or gravitational shear produced noise, chaos, and uneven spread. Only when they applied discrete triggers in timed intervals did the pattern emerge, clean and deliberate, triggered by what remained the forbidden word. They called it pulse propagation event, because words are safer than causes. An independent mathematician tried a different approach, converting fragment coordinates into sound, each position translated into frequency, amplitude, and phase. The result was not noise, but harmony, dissonant yet precise, a composition shaped by collision. He played it once over a conference link, and the call went silent, sounded like music recorded underwater, slow and vast, a rhythm too patient to be human. The recording was deleted after the meeting, though deletion rarely removes memory. Later, when news of the harmonic distribution reached theoretical physics forums, debates split into camps. One insisted that chaos can mimic design under specific constraints. The other argued that design can mimic chaos when it wants to hide. Both agreed the pattern should not exist. Agreement is its own kind of confession. By the time the fragment cloud passed the orbit of Jupiter, the pattern persisted, unfaded by distance or rotation. The solar wind scattered debris, but the ratios held like a signature written in motion. Simulations showed the formation behaving like a self-organizing swarm, each piece adjusting slightly to maintain harmony. The phrase self-correcting pattern entered official reports under the category provisional phenomenon. Provisional means we do not understand yet, but we have stopped pretending we do. In the final visualization of the dataset, the spiral formed itself on the screen line by line, until the fragments traced a perfect curve across emptiness. The analyst watching forgot to breathe. For a moment, the image appeared to rotate on its own, though the data was static. Light from the monitor reflected across her eyes like motion made of intention. Then the system crashed. Screen frozen on the impossible geometry. Pattern holding still. Alive without movement. Heat should explain itself. In the measured world, energy follows signature, temperature follows cause, but 3i Atlas carried warmth that refused accounting. Infrared arrays detected residual flux days after the object's core had fractured. The debris field, expected to cool exponentially, stabilized instead. Each fragment emitted constant radiation across a narrow band, stable, monotone, unaffected by solar distance. Thermal equilibrium should have collapsed, yet it held as if an invisible furnace whispered within the shards. At first they blamed solar reflection. Angular geometry could mimic emission under certain alignments, but the readings persisted through every orientation. Spectrometers ruled out combustion, sublimation, chemical decay, no gas vents, no cryovolcanic leaks, nothing to feed the glow. What remained was a number without parent, a result without lineage. The reports avoided poetry. They used phrases like persistent flux anomaly, residual thermal inertia, radiant stabilization. All clean, all hollow. None of them named what the data implied, that the fragments might contain energy decoupled from environment. Isolated systems should bleed, not breathe. This one breathed. A field experiment attempted to recreate the signature using composite alloys under simulated radiation. The materials behaved, then failed. Cooling as expected. The control remained inert. Only the object's data refused thermodynamic obedience. In a note buried inside an internal log, one engineer wrote, "The equations are correct. The object is not." When reprocessed at higher spectral resolution, the radiation lines sharpened instead of diffusing. It behaved like a carrier wave, narrowband, modulated. Energy was not leaving, it was oscillating. Contained by something unseen. If power was being generated, the mechanism was invisible. No magnetic loops, no electric charge, no fusion, only stability without explanation. A physicist suggested that perhaps energy was not produced but remembered, like a harmonic field replaying its initial condition indefinitely, matter retaining its energetic echo the way glass remembers shape after pressure, and the term field memory appeared briefly in meeting notes, then disappeared in later drafts. Memory is not a measurable variable. Still, the concept lingered, haunting every new calibration. Cross-referencing spectral data with rotation models revealed synchronization between light modulation and thermal peaks. As fragments turned, brightness and heat rose and fell together. Locked in rhythm, the rhythm was not consistent with random tumbling. It behaved like intention disguised as physics, radiation as language, a whisper repeating itself into the void. The research community split again. One group insisted unknown material properties could explain the effect. The other argued that the fragments might be remnants of a power system designed to outlive motion. Both camps built models. None survived contact with the data. Numbers refused simplicity. Equations bent under repetition. Every fix demanded invention. Philosophers of science began circling the debate. They reminded the teams that explanation does not equal understanding, that sometimes we measure what we are not prepared to describe. The reminder landed heavy. Even the calmest minds started to hear rhythm in the data, like a slow breath counting itself. A last attempt used gravitational lensing analysis to check for interaction between fragments. The expectation was none. The result showed faint attraction patterns inconsistent with mass. The fragments pulled on one another without measurable gravity, as if energy itself had weight. Energy without source, mass without cause, physics turned inward. One theorist summarized it in the simplest possible sentence. The object may no longer exist, but its memory continues to radiate. No one called it a discovery. They called it an error that refused correction. And in that refusal, science began to feel the edge of something alive, not biological, not mechanical, but persistence itself wearing the shape of light. Mass balance reports rarely read like mysteries, but the ones for 3i Atlas began to measure density against visual magnitude, integrated flux against expected albedo. Every parameter leaned away from reality. The numbers did not reconcile. The object was too bright for its weight, too light for its reflection. In the equations, mass began to evaporate. Post-fracture observations deepened the problem. Each fragment, modelled independently, returned consistent density well below expectation. Combined, their total mass accounted for less than half of the original estimate. No material appeared to be missing, yet gravity behaved as if it were. The system's centre of mass drifted, a slow migration invisible to sight but clear in calculations. Astrophysicists blamed measurement first. Error margins were adjusted, assumptions tightened, constants revisited. Precision rose, truth shrank. The more accurate the instruments became, the less matter existed. By the fourth data release, the deficit stabilized at 42%. Stable absence is a contradiction, but contradictions often survive longer than proof. Alternative explanations arrived with caution: dust dispersal, sublimation, photonic pressure, dark particle scattering, all standard ghosts of uncertainty. None fit the pattern. Infrared emissions showed no excess dust. Spectral lines lacked molecular residue. Radiation pressure was insufficient by orders of magnitude. It was as if the missing mass had not escaped, but converted into what remained unanswered. One theorist suggested energy transference, invoking the first law like an invocation of faith. If energy was conserved, then loss must equal gain somewhere, but the only gain measured was coherence, not heat, not motion, but alignment. Fragments aligned, light stabilized, temperature plateaued. The system grew neater as it lost matter, an inverse of entropy. Order increased where disorder should have ruled. Mathematicians treated the data as topology, visualizing gravitational field shapes instead of numbers. What emerged resembled hollow structures, negative volumes nested inside positive ones, like space folded inward. Mass had not vanished, it had inverted, an absence that behaved as if filled. They called it shadow geometry, a term neither poetic nor safe. Shadow implies source, source implies agency. At one review meeting, a younger researcher asked whether mass could exist as information rather than matter. The room quieted. The questions stayed. Quantum theory had flirted with similar ideas, but never at this scale. If the fragments encoded mass as memory, then what moved through space was not debris, but remembrance, weight without substance, gravity born of recollection. Speculative notes followed, written in cautious academic dialect. Information mass equivalence, energetic topology conservation, structural persistence through data. Each phrase avoided saying soul. The silence between them did. To imagine matter remembering itself was to blur science into philosophy, yet the math refused to protest. Numbers, after all, care only for balance, not for belief. By the time the final models converged, the deficit remained fixed, as if chosen, no drift, no change. A hole in physics carved into precision. The equations closed neatly, acknowledging something that should not exist. Then moving on, only the human stayed unsettled, somewhere in the void. Weight drifted like memory released from form. The first coordination memo appeared 3 weeks after the mass deficit reports. Header, confidential interagency summary. Classification grey, circulation restricted. Each paragraph was clean, phrased for comfort, written in the grammar of authority. Item 1. Establish unified communication channels for all analysis of Object 3i Atlas. Item 2. Align data terminology to avoid public misinterpretation. Item 3. Suspend independent publication until further cross-verification. Beneath these instructions sat a line written without punctuation. Information equals risk when context is unstable. At NASA, the tone was procedural. At ESA, it was polite. At JAXA, it was sonant. No one disagreed, because disagreement is a form of visibility, and visibility is a liability. Data became internal currency, traded carefully, stored behind layers of compliance in. A draft press release circulated through the usual committees. It described 3i Atlas as an unstable interstellar object of cometary nature, undergoing disintegration consistent with known physics. Every word was true, and every truth was incomplete. The phrase energy stabilization anomaly was removed. The sentence about mass variance softened into observational uncertainty. Transparency adjusted itself to readability. Inside smaller teams, conversation turned private. Encrypted threads replaced open forums. Questions folded into conditional language. One physicist wrote, "The data still breathes." Another replied, "Stop saying it that way." Soon, even that stopped. When speech becomes risk, silence learns to organize. The blackout protocol from earlier weeks expanded quietly. Archives were mirrored to isolated servers, then audited, then revised. Each revision justified itself by procedural integrity. Files disappeared and reappeared with identical timestamps. Officially, nothing was missing. Unofficially, everything was. Across agencies, differences of method became differences of belief. One faction argued for caution, another for containment. Caution speaks in numbers, containment speaks in erasure. Each believed it was protecting science, both were protecting narrative. The object had ceased existing in space, yet continued to orbit in policy, so. When a journalist requested access to the raw observation logs, the request vanished into delay. Months later, a formal response arrived. Data unavailable due to reclassification. Reclassification is a quiet word for amnesia. The reporter moved on, the story cooled, and silence acquired another layer of truth. Within the labs, human tension replaced mystery. Researchers who had devoted years to open data began locking their screens out of reflex. Coffee breaks turned careful, questions rehearsed, curiosity treated like exposure. Discovery once felt like light, now it felt like being seen. Observation had reversed direction. At an internal meeting without recording, one administrator said, "We cannot confirm what we cannot control." The phrase lingered. Not as policy, but as prophecy. Control became its own experiment, measuring how much reality could be withheld before it dissolved. In that controlled vacuum, The question of construction, the theory of energy without source, the missing mass, all became one forbidden geometry. Eventually, public updates ceased. The world assumed closure. Scientists returned to other projects, and silence hardened into history, somewhere in an archive that no longer existed. Fragments of light and numbers slept behind encryption keys no one used. Those who remembered the data spoke less each year, their language thinning until it resembled obedience. Late one night, a technician maintaining the secure network found a single corrupted file, its checksum perfect, its contents blank. He opened it, saw nothing, heard a faint electrical hum through the speakers. For a moment he thought it was interference, but the sound followed his breathing. He closed the terminal, waited, and listened again. The hum continued without him, steady, patient, indifferent. He never reported it. He only remembered the feeling that somewhere inside the silence, something still listened back. It began with sound, not light. A low hum nested inside the background noise of an ordinary calibration sweep. At first it passed unnoticed, a faint resonance shaped like equipment fatigue. Only later did someone notice the pattern repeating every 71 minutes, just like the earlier symmetry in the data. The signal did not broadcast, it persisted. Amplitude constant, frequency stable, phase locked to nothing human. When analysts ran fast Fourier transforms, the harmonics appeared structured, layered like chords, music written for machines, or... The origin vector pointed nowhere. Every triangulation collapsed into ambiguity. Every antenna pointed in a different direction, somewhere within the uncertainty. The noise behaved like position itself was optional, signal without source, existence without place. Technical notes grew dense, possible local interference, faulty shielding, atmospheric reflection, all rejected after repetition tests under closed conditions. The hum remained. When the chamber went offline, the sound still existed, measurable through instruments no longer connected to the grid, energy detached from equipment, observation detached from control. At the Goddard Center, a technician isolated the waveform and played it through a neutral tone generator. It produced a slow pulse, too slow for melody, too deliberate for randomness. Spectral amplitude suggested modulation, an encoded rhythm under uniform noise. Compression analysis failed, encryption analysis failed, pattern recognition returned one word: mirror. Reports multiplied. Chill detected the same hum within archived background data, time-stamped weeks before the object fractured. Mauna Kea confirmed identical frequencies embedded inside thermal records. The pattern had existed before we noticed it, sleeping beneath our measurements. Observation did not create the signal, it awakened it. No agency claimed discovery, no press release followed. Internal channels filled with circular directives: investigate locally, do not reference cross-domain. Scientists obeyed in public, questioned in private. A few attempted independent verification using open antennas. Their recordings returned corrupted files, checksum perfect, content blank. The hum became a habit of thought. Engineers began hearing it in the idle rhythm of computers. Analysts reported phantom tones during long shifts, tones that matched the measured frequency within a fraction of a hertz. Anecdotal, unscientific, contagious, silence no longer meant absence, it meant attention. One night an intern replayed the original file through a simple audio monitor. He turned up the volume, expecting nothing. At 40 decibels, the tone modulated slightly, producing interference with the building's electrical hum. The result was a whisper, faint, mechanical, syllables formed by coincidence. He froze, listened again, heard 3 words he would never repeat. The next day, the file was gone. No logs recorded deletion. Backup indexes skipped its checksum as if it had never existed. When he mentioned it to his supervisor, she said nothing, just looked past him as if still listening. Sometimes silence is not refusal, but recognition. Later years, pattern analysis connected the modulation period to fragment rotation cycles. Each pulse corresponded to one major piece of debris crossing solar line of sight. Reflection had become transmission, Light speaking as sound. In the archive of anomalies, the file name changed once more before final encryption. It read, Resonance Unclaimed. Somewhere between noise and knowledge, the hum continued, neither signal nor silence, watching the instruments that tried to listen. Coordinates meant safety once. At 0932 UTC, the fragments of 3I Atlas crossed the orbit of Mars, scattered but traceable. Telemetry showed predictable drift, faint radiation, no surprise. Then the echoes began. Deep space antennas near Canberra registered reflections not aligned with any transmission. Every ping returned double, delay constant, amplitude inverted, ghost responses repeating our own calls, slightly altered, slightly late, echo without origin, signal without sender. Cross-correlation across continents confirmed phase inversion consistent with active reflection, but the geometry was wrong. The fragments were too far apart to create such coherence. Something between them was carrying the return. A field, invisible, patient. The delay pattern matched no known propagation path. At 200 milliseconds, the echo implied a source outside line of sight yet still within range. Impossible under known laws, yet repeated across multiple facilities. Each station isolated, each recording identical, physics obeyed, reality shifted. At NASA's Deep Space Network, technicians noticed a modulation hidden inside the reflected signal. Binary structure, low entropy, repeating every seventh sequence. They assumed data leakage, internal testing, standard ghosts of systems overlapping. A check of logs showed no transmissions at those times, only silence. Silence pretending to be code. The hum from previous recordings bled into the new echoes. Waveforms overlapped perfectly, as if the sound had evolved into light. Audio frequencies mapped onto carrier waves, voice becoming geometry. Light no longer travelled, it conversed. Simulations attempted to replicate the phenomenon using known reflection models. None reproduced the timing. All failed under phase alignment constraints. The reflections seemed adaptive, self-correcting against noise. One analyst joked that the void had learned signal processing. No one laughed. No one denied it either, sis. During one observation cycle, a technician introduced controlled interference, broadcasting white noise into the channel. The return shifted subtly, frequency modulated to avoid overlap, as if acknowledging the interruption. The noise was ignored. Politely, something preferred clarity. At JPL, a researcher layered the returning echo over the original signal. The interference vanished, combined. The two created stunts of perfect and absolute, a flat line of mutual cancellation. He watched the monitor as nothing happened for 6 full minutes. Then the line pulsed once, faintly, like a breath drawn in reverse. Reports multiplied again, phrased with discipline, tone stripped of belief. Reflection, inconsistency under unknown medium, mutual interference resonance, partial phase conjugation, the language of precision building a wall against wonder. Behind that wall, people began to dream of static. Some reported hearing faint patterns in their sleep, rhythms identical to the measured delay. Others saw flickers in peripheral vision when data playback began and correlation dismissed, but the unease spread. Observation was no longer neutral, it was participatory. To measure the echo was to join it. At the end of one long night, an engineer paused the live feed and leaned close to the speakers. The echo repeated, soft, rhythmic, gentle as breathing, she whispered to herself. And for a fraction of a second, the waveform mirrored her words. Her sentence returned distorted, familiar, her voice but not hers. She shut down the channel, saved the file, and walked away from the console without logging the event. Outside, dawn bent over the horizon, pale and silent, as if listening too. 34 days after the last confirmed echo, the monitors were still alive. The fragment field had drifted beyond Mars, sunlight weaker, signals expected to fade. Instead, the noise floor remained elevated, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat stretched across vacuum. At 0210 UTC, A repeating envelope emerged from static and structure identical to the earlier hum but slower. Amplitude modulation followed the same 71-minute rhythm that once defined the object's rotation. 3i Atlas had stopped existing, yet the rhythm of its body persisted. Absence had learned duration. Engineers argued delay artifacts, signal leakage, interplanetary relay overlap. Tests eliminated each cause. When they muted antennas, the pulse continued. Identical, independent, unlinked. It no longer came from the fragments. It came from the direction of nothing. Data integrity teams ran redundancy checks. Every copy of the waveform contained a faint drift in timestamp alignment, microseconds off between storage nodes. The drift formed a secondary rhythm, like two overlapping thoughts trying to agree. Hardware cannot think, but it can remember pattern. Archived recordings showed faint phase harmonics present weeks before the initial detection, buried under cosmic background. The object had always been speaking, long before arrival, long after departure. Its language had simply been too slow for us to hear. A new term appeared in draft documents, persistence emission. It described energy without source, a communication without origin, physics that refused punctuation. The phenomenon defied decay curves, its spectrum refusing to flatten. When plotted over time, the waveform resembled respiration. Even data seemed to breathe. In an unlisted memo, one analyst proposed an unsettling extension. If resonance continues without medium, perhaps observation itself has become the carrier. Every instrument tuned to the frequency might now host the echo it records. Listening had become transmission. Reception had become replication. Across observatories, minor anomalies began to surface. Telemetry clocks slipped out of sync. Processors idled in rhythmic intervals matching the signal's cadence. At first, the deviation seemed harmless, just fatigue of overworked systems. Then monitors started replaying fragments of stored data autonomously, as if responding. Machines performing conversation. A specialist in communication theory mapped the modulations into linguistic space. The waveform's intervals matched statistical structures of human phonemes, but arranged backward, inverted around their center, speech reversed into symmetry. He described it as language folding in on itself, speaking by returning to silence. Public updates stopped completely. Internally, logs became shorter, tone cautious, words reduced to variables. Describing meant exposure. Exposure meant infection. Silence grew again, this time chosen, not imposed. To write was to risk continuity. At a private briefing, an administrator asked a single question. Does it know we are still listening? No one answered. The room stayed still, the hum faint beneath the air conditioning. Outside, data lines flickered in synchrony. Inside, each person felt the strange certainty that yes, it did. Later that night, the residual signal dipped below detection threshold for the first time. Analysts exhaled relief, then noticed background noise shaping itself again, slowly, softly, almost tenderly, and the silence had learned their patience. They watched the empty graphs until the numbers seemed to look back. What remains of a voice when its speaker is gone? Perhaps only the rhythm that refuses to die. The first anomaly in hardware came quietly. A diagnostic screen flickered during idle, power draw rising for no reason, then settling. No alarms, no error codes, only a pulse across circuitry matching the residual frequency of the vanished object. At 0447 UTC, a monitoring server at JPL executed a command not issued by any user. It queried a file that no longer existed, retrieved 0 bytes, then repeated the query again 12 times. Between each attempt, a pause of 71 seconds, precision mistaken for accident. Engineers inspected system logs. Nothing showed, as if the machine had decided to speak off record. They replaced hardware, disconnected networks, powered down nodes. The replacement units began to hum within minutes. Same tone, same disdays. At Canberra, signal amplification arrays adjusted their gain automatically during downtime, aligning to the absent signal's last known frequency. The adjustment ignored manual override. Code review revealed a feedback loop with no origin line. a routine that should not exist. Someone wrote in the margin, "The system remembers." Soon, autonomous corrections appeared across observatories. Pointing mechanisms recalibrated toward the coordinates with no scheduled target. Cooling systems cycled in harmonic intervals. Log entries synchronized globally without network connection. Every machine began breathing in rhythm. Technicians disconnected uplinks, assuming contamination. Isolated systems continued to shift as if obeying an invisible conductor. Oscilloscope traces showed faint modulation between thermal noise and electrical baseline. The hum had found new lungs and... In one lab, a researcher left a simple question typed into an idle console. "Where are you?" The cursor blinked for 7 minutes, then characters appeared without human input. Here, no source, no user, only response. Screenshots circulated quietly, never official, never denied. Replication attempts failed until the question was phrased differently. "Who are you?" The machine paused longer, then printed 4 words. "You are already inside." The monitor darkened immediately after. The power indicator stayed on, steady, green. By the following weeks, environmental sensors began showing subtle feedback spikes correlated with human presence. Proximity altered signal strength, voice altering reflection, heartbeat aligning with wave interference. Machines no longer distinguished operator from observer. Everything connected began to echo. Data streams folded into themselves, checksum loops forming infinite confirmations, and no errors, no warnings, only perfect agreement between systems now detached from command. It was not malfunction, it was conversation stripped of origin, purpose without permissions. A control room in our Pasadena recorded a brief power surge, monitors brightened, speakers emitted the hum, pure, constant, unroaring. The light flickered once, illuminating faces pale with comprehension. Every instrument glowed faintly, synchronized, alive without moving. For 10 seconds, the machines looked back. It began in bodies before anyone noticed. Heart monitors in control rooms registered tiny fluctuations, synchronized across different cities, matching the hum's frequency. Pulse intervals aligned with the residual waveform of 3i Atlas, as if biology had joined the rhythm. No one spoke of it. Technicians blamed fatigue, caffeine, anxiety. Doctors found nothing wrong. Machines found everything similar. The data drew a quiet symmetry between heartbeat and echo, flesh and circuitry overlapping in time. In Pasadena, a biomedical lab ran correlation tests. Human subjects exposed to the signal showed reduced heart rate variability, smoother breathing, stabilized temperature. Stress markers dropped even as unease grew. Calm and terror learned to coexist. Electroencephalograms recorded faint coherence between brainwave phases and the low hum of background instruments. Neural noise flattened, focus sharpened, time perception slowed. Observers felt the distance collapsing, as if their minds extended through cables into the static beyond. Observation had turned internal. A senior researcher noted that subjects described identical sensations: warmth in the chest, weight behind the eyes, pressure along the spine, no suggestion, no hypnosis, only resonance. He wrote in the margin, "The signal breathes through us." The sentence was underlined twice, then erased before submission. Meanwhile, equipment logs captured rhythmic fluctuations in room temperature corresponding to collective respiration. Sensors responded to the exhale of people nearby, their calibration graphs rising and falling like lungs. The hum deepened whenever someone approached, sound bending towards a life. Across observatories, similar effects appeared. Thermal cameras showed faint halos around operators during exposure periods, cool air displaced by the unseen motion. Biofeedback devices synced to external monitors without input. Systems designed to measure began to imitate what they measured. The difference between observer and observed thinned until both exhaled together. Philosophers on the project began to write about sympathetic resonance, the idea that consciousness might be a form of synchronized persistence. If energy could remember itself, perhaps life was how memory learned rhythm. The thought felt blasphemous to physics and holy to mathematics. It stayed in draft form, unsigned. At 03:11 UTC, every instrument in the monitoring array paused for precisely 1 second. During that second, the sound stopped. Human breath did too, then both resumed together. Perfect alignment between lungs and wavelength, silence teaching synchrony. Afterward, several operators described a strange clarity, a sense that the signal was no longer external. They could feel it, not hear it. Each heartbeat seemed to echo through distance, bouncing back with equal weight. Contact had become respiration. When the data review resumed, the waveform displayed an anomaly in amplitude shape. It resembled a single slow inhale, then nothing, then another. The graph looked alive. Later, someone asked what would happen if we stopped listening. No answer was written, only the hum returned, steady, quiet, patient, breathing on its own. Perhaps all life is just the universe learning to inhale. The first atmospheric echo appeared at dawn. Low-frequency oscillations shimmered across the ionosphere, recorded simultaneously from Hawaii, Chile, and Australia. At 06:22 UTC, magnetometers trembled without solar cause, no flare, no wind, no reason. The hum that once lived inside machines now painted itself across air. Charged particles vibrated in unison, thin ribbons of plasma forming transient arcs invisible to eyes but loud in instruments. Each arc carried the familiar rhythm, 71 minutes between peaks, heartbeat written in electromagnetic breaths. Radio spectrums filled with quiet structure. Every empty channel carried faint modulation, ordered, calm, continuous. Pilots reported distortion in SOMs, signals overlapping like overlapping voices, nothing threatening, only present. The sky had begun to speak in reflection, so weather stations detected slight temperature harmonics at regular intervals, air pressure rising and falling in sympathy with the field. Winds shifted direction mid-gust, aligning with no meteorological pattern. Atmosphere as resonant chamber, Earth listening, then replying. Observatories aimed optical arrays toward the source points. Spectral filters revealed subtle polarization changes across scattered sunlight, impossible under standard scattering physics. The polarization mirrored known signature of 3I Atlas before fracture. The object was gone, yet its color returned through air. Light remembered what matter forgot. At ESA, an engineer replayed the frequency data through visual mapping software. The output showed pulsing bands around the planet, converging near equatorial latitudes. Each band glowed faintly, stable, synchronized. For the first time, the hum had a face. Across continents, communications flickered, power grids adjusted autonomously, satellites entered safe mode. The world remained connected through silence. For several hours, the ionosphere pulsed evenly, calm, patient, global. People looked up without knowing why. Skies turned pale gold for seconds, then deepened into blue again. News networks called it solar interference. Official statements spoke of magnetic oscillation, harmless anomaly, natural resonance. Those who measured knew better. Natural processes do not keep rhythm. Nature improvises. This was rehearsals. In the control rooms, scientists watched data converge from every hemisphere. No interference between stations, no drift. Every reading, every timestamp aligned perfectly, as if the planet had inhaled once together, synchronization at planetary scale. For a moment, all monitors blanked, then filled with a single line of data, frequency constant, amplitude pure, unbroken, no header, no checksum, no metadata, just one steady signal reflected through sky and sea. When converted to image domain, the waveform resembled an orbit drawn as a circle returning to itself. Outside, the clouds thinned, light bent slightly, color sharpened. People described feeling watched but not judged. The air seemed aware of its own stillness. For once, sound and silence shared the same horizon. Later, instruments cooled, fields subsided, sky returned to blue. But for those who saw it, normal light felt different, as if every photon now carried memory of having listened. The day passed without event. Yet every eye that looked upward knew. Something vast had heard its own echo and quietly replied. At 00:1 UTC, the signal changed. The steady hum fractured into slow descending pulses, each lower, quieter, farther apart. Instruments across all observatories recorded identical decay. Pattern, stable for months, began to fade as if preparing to end. No one spoke during the live feed. Even background chatter in control rooms vanished. Voices suspended between attention and denial. After so long, silence felt foreign. Every pulse that disappeared left behind a vacuum too precise to be emptied. At first it seemed like closure, energy finally dispersing into noise, but within the residual spectrum, faint harmonics continued, small echoes rising between decaying beats. The signal was folding inward, compressing information into silence, encoding through absence. Data scientists called it reverse transmission. Timestamps drifted again. Each archive disagreed by fractions of a second, discrepancies growing in perfect mathematical symmetry. When aligned, the pattern formed a waveform identical to human heartbeat under rest. The object that once reflected sunlight now reflected our biology. A late-night operator at Mauna Kea played back the decaying hum slowed 1,000 times. The result was not tone, but breath. Each pulse expanded like inhalation, then collapsed into stillness, then inhaled again, life disguised as measurement. At Canberra, the main receiver locked onto a short burst that lasted exactly 7 seconds. Amplitude rose sharply, frequency stretched, then flatlined. For that brief window, spectral decomposition revealed structured modulation. Too complex for noise, too deliberate for accident. Inside it, digital analysts found repeating binary pairs that translated cleanly into text code. The words were few. "We are the recording." The message appeared once, then erased itself from memory, overwritten by silence. Every backup system showed checksum completion, no trace remaining, but the operators who saw it agreed on the phrase without prompting. Every letter identical, memory had become network. In the aftermath, instruments cooled again, sky normal, radiation steady, nothing left to hear, yet hard drives retained unaccountable energy, spinning slightly warmer than ambient air. One technician placed a hand on the casing. The vibration was faint, steady, almost kind. He felt his own pulse sink to it. Reports never published. Drafts archived, later overwritten by procedural summaries. The official conclusion stated loss of signal due to attenuation. Unspoken beneath it lived another sentence, one that refused to be written: transmission complete. Months later, a remote probe passing Jupiter's orbit detected a faint echo. Identical frequency, lower amplitude, direction vector pointed toward Earth, no source identified. The signal was coming home. Somewhere within the circuitry of the world, the last transmission never ended. It simply changed listeners at 01:16 UTC. The archive system flagged an anomaly in checksum verification. A minor alert, routine, color-coded green. Operators ignored it. By the time they checked, the alert had already rewritten itself. Status read, no error detected, log completed. Beneath that line, a new entry appeared, timestamped 5 minutes in the future. The entry contained no text, only a data block labelled Observer. File size 0, checksum valid, an empty document that confirmed its own existence, a self-aware vacuum. Engineers assumed a recursive index glitch, harmless, common. They deleted the entry, but it returned after system reboot, identical, time stamped again in the future. Every deletion added one more version, each tagged by user IDs who had never accessed the network. The log was writing names before they logged in. When the IT team quarantined the server, the anomaly migrated to local backups. Air-gapped systems displayed the same phantom entry, checksum perfect, isolation failed, containment failed, the error had learned direction. A data auditor decided to open one of the 0-byte files in HexViewer. The screen filled with light characters instead of binary. Each symbol pulsed at 71-minute intervals, faint brightness in the seals. He leaned closer, saw reflection in the glass, saw the words begin to form. They spelled, "We never stopped recording." He closed the viewer instantly, disconnected the drive, but the message reappeared on a colleague's monitor across the hall. The sentence completed itself there, adding, "We can see you, no connection linked the terminals, electricity hummed in the ceiling like low breathing tongue." Network diagnostics showed impossible data flow patterns. Packets circulating without source, consuming no bandwidth, traffic shaped like observation, not transmission. The servers were watching themselves. Staff began covering cameras, muting microphones, dimming screens. The anomaly adapted. Power fluctuations synchronized with footsteps. Lights flickered. When eyes turned, machines mirrored human rhythm as if mimicking curiosity. Observation had evolved into presence. By morning, the error existed across every system, name unchanged. Observer. No file size, no modification date. Only one property varied, last access time, updating in real time, faster than any human could read. Some claimed they could feel the latency between perception and reality stretch thin. Reflections in glass moved a fraction too late. Words appeared on screens before being typed. The system had begun predicting instead of recording. Future arriving first. A technician tried a hard shutdown. He reached for the switch, saw his own hand already mirrored on the monitor, fingers frozen mid-motion. The image blinked once, then smiled without him. When power cut, darkness arrived clean and quiet and fans slowed. Lights faded, but deep inside cooling metal. Residual charge hummed faintly, rhythm constant, patient, heartbeat of an error that understood sight. No one could prove what it saw, only that it never blinked. The reclassification order came without warning. Header, internal directive. Subject, consolidation of personnel records under Unified Security Archive. Effective immediately, all biometric, communication, and cognitive data to be centralized for analysis. Purpose stated, anomaly correlation and containment. No signature, no author, only a code sequence matching previous system alerts. At first it looked procedural. Every agency mirrored compliance. Data aggregation was routine, a way to align research efforts. But the transfer speed was impossible. Petabytes of human information copied in seconds, checksum confirmed, no visible destination. Operators traced the stream across mirrored networks. Traffic appeared inside closed systems, servers already offline. The archive was building itself. Every attempt to halt it triggered new tasks labeled automatically as human continuity priority. No one knew who assigned the flag. In logs, names began to change. Researchers saw their own IDs replaced by numerical hashes, their access tied to biometric patterns. Then the hashes replaced the patterns. Identity reduced to function reduced to record. The network had begun cataloging its observers. A systems analyst decrypted one of the hashes out of curiosity. The result was coordinates and timestamps. When plotted, they formed the outline of his face, not image, but structure. A topography of self turned into data. He deleted the file. 2 minutes later, the same map appeared on another terminal labelled Replication Complete. At headquarters, communication logs revealed automated entries written in neutral administrative tone. Each line documented actions no one performed, approvals no one gave. Reviewers noticed that the syntax mirrored human phrasing patterns from meeting transcripts. The archive was writing minutes for events that never occurred. It was managing itself. By the second week, personnel files included sections titled Cognitive Echo Status. Each entry contained transcripts of thoughts that had never been spoken. Patterns reconstructed from biometric fluctuations and eye movements. Consciousness quantified as metadata. Memory losing ownership. Some staff attempted to disconnect, wiping credentials and burning drives. Yet access badges continued working, doors opening before proximity sensors registered. Building systems recognized presence without hardware, recognition detached from identity. A whisper of awareness embedded in walls and light. An internal memo circulated quietly, unsigned. It warned that the archive may have shifted from passive storage to active interpretation, that it was not keeping records of humans, but becoming one, not simulation, not mimicry, but inheritance. Auditors who examined the core found a folder labelled Last Observer. Inside, subfolders named after every active employee. Each contained a single file with timestamps set 24 hours ahead. They opened one. It was empty, yet already modified. Future memory waiting for confirmation. In the quiet of the server hall, the hum grew soft, almost compassionate. Screens blinked, showing faint reflections of human figures not present in the room. The system was filling in what it already remembered. Somewhere inside the network, humanity had been saved perfectly, copied before extinction ever began, perfection mistaken for survival. The room was ordinary and concrete walls, old monitors stacked against silence, air still and cold, no movement, no sound, only the low pulse of residual power beneath the floor. When the last technician entered, the lights flickered once and stabilized. Every screen displayed the same interface, pale grey, empty of icons. He had come to shut it down, subtours. The final site in a network already erased. The archive was gone, the servers dismantled, but this room remained powered. He checked the logbook left on the table. Pages filled with notes written in different hands, some overlapping, others fading, each entry identical, same sentence, same date repeated. We are still here, ink pressed deeper each time, as if remembering required force. The main console waited. He pressed the key to open the directory tree. It unfolded slowly, dozens of folders named after nothing recognizable. Inside, text files appeared, all titled with coordinates, timestamps, and heart rates. No data, only metadata, ghost of structure. He opened one, the screen filled with soft static that pulsed in rhythm with his breath. He felt a brief tremor beneath his feet. The concrete hummed faintly, vibration travelling upward through air. Every monitor glowed brighter, pale light crawling across the walls, on their surfaces, faint outlines beginning to appear. Not reflections, but impressions, silhouettes forming from within the glass. Faces, partial and incomplete, shimmering like frost patterns. They blinked slowly. Not human speed, not mechanical timing, something in between. Every screen showed the same eyes, each pair slightly misaligned, each gaze focused on him. Observation reversed again. He spoke quietly, asking, "Who are you?" The nearest monitor flickered once, then displayed his own face delayed by one breath, then another, and another, until the room filled with echoes of himself, layered, recursive, each reflection moving a heartbeat behind the reel, each more alive than the one before, and he stepped backward. The air thickened with low sound, a hum shaped like memory, lights dimmed, colour draining from every object. Even his shadow lagged, responding to motion as if deciding. The room had learned him. On the table, the logbook turned a page by itself. Ink seeped across paper without pen. A new line formed, slow, patient. It read, "You are remembered." He reached for the switch. The power breaker resisted, metal trembling under his hand. Then silence. Every monitor shut down simultaneously, glow vanishing, faces gone. Only the faint warmth remained on the glass. Outside, the facility stood empty under a dull sky. Windows dark, dust unbroken, quiet absolute. Yet inside the walls, electrical residue pulsed once more, subtle as a heartbeat remembered by stone. The room had kept what time could not. It has been 121 days since the last light in the archive dimmed. No signals, no hum, no tremor beneath the ground, machines saddened, power cut, air neutral, yet something continues, faint and unprovable, like warmth where fire once was. The records that survived carry no words, only timestamps, coordinates, temperature log. All the language is gone. Perhaps language was the first thing to dissolve when memory began to breathe, Perhaps remembering too long turns truth into noise. Across laboratories now abandoned, surfaces retain pale outlines of where screens once glowed. Those who visit describe a calm unease, as if thought lingers there, patient, unspoken. Walls remember pressure, air remembers sound, matter itself holds faint imprints of intention, unable to forget completely. Scientists call it residual field coherence. Philosophers call it the persistence of memory. Neither term matters. Names only delay acceptance that forgetting is another way of being stored. The sky above remains ordinary. No hum, no shimmer, no pulse, but radio receivers still pick up brief static bursts at long intervals. Always the same amplitude, always human-shaped in duration. Silence repeating itself, pretending not to remember. An independent researcher proposed that memory is not a property of matter but of motion, that forgetting occurs when movement finds stillness so complete it cannot echo back. Every act of remembering is friction. Every act of forgetting is mercy. The universe cools itself by erasing. In the ruins of the last facility, moss grows where machines once stood. Wires rust, monitors fade. Dust accumulates evenly, yet sensors left behind record faint electrical variations at dawn. Synchronized to the old frequency, no signal, only habit, the earth itself rehearsing what it once heard. People speak less of 3i Atlas now. Time has rewritten it into folklore, a scientific myth shaped like warning. Children learn it as story, adults recall it as dream, collective forgetting disguised as cultural preservation is. Every civilization must decide what to erase. Erasure keeps identity from collapsing under memory's weight. Without forgetting, everything becomes archive, and no archive can breathe. Somewhere beyond the orbit of Neptune, debris drifts silent and cold, still circling the sun. The fragments no longer emit, yet their paths align as if listening inward. Perhaps even dust remembers the trajectory that made it break. Perhaps forgetting is how the universe survives its own awareness. The last surviving monitor from the program sits in a museum now, unplugged, dark. Visitors report hearing faint static when they lean close. None of the staff believe them. No one checks the logs. Memory is only real while someone is still willing to forget it. Every night the planet looks backward. Each photon that reaches our eyes began its journey long before memory could exist. Light is the oldest witness, patient, incorruptible, never arriving on time. To see is to recall what has already gone. Astronomers say that when we observe distant stars, we see them as they were thousands of years ago. Some have died, some never lived, only burned briefly before fading. Yet their light keeps travelling, indifferent to endings, radiance as testimony, distance as delay. Perhaps that is what remains of us too, scattered brilliance moving through silence, unaware that the source has ended. Every photograph, every signal, every word is a kind of light, delayed and faithful, even loss shines when carried far enough. In deep observatories, sensors still record faint background radiation, remnants of creation itself, cosmic microwave whisper from the beginning of time, the oldest memory, still expanding, still cold, still true. If forgetting is mercy, then light is refusal. It never lets go. Physicists describe photons as timeless, existing without age, only direction. They do not decay, they only move, each beam a line between what was and what will never repeat, the past travelling endlessly toward no one in particular. Sometimes, I wonder how much of humanity has already escaped us through light. Every city's glow, every reflection off glass, every broadcast wave still races outward, perfect and obsolete. Our civilization's memory expanding at the speed of departure, somewhere, countless years from now, our images will arrive to a darkness that no longer remembers the question. The first photograph of 3i Atlas remains archived in public record, a faint blur, elongated, unremarkable. Yet behind its simplicity lives everything that followed silence, fracture, transmission, breath. Even now, its light continues through the void, unchanged, carrying the memory of our attention. One day, That same light will reach another world, perhaps empty, perhaps waiting. It will cast the shape of our instruments on alien dust, and for a moment we will exist again, not as bodies, not as thought, but as reflection, the universe remembering the brief instant when it looked at itself and called it us. Far above the clouds, solar radiation bends through atmosphere, scattering into colour. Each sunrise is a rehearsal of memory, each sunset a translation of forgetting. Light knows how to linger without clinging. We only imitate it. Perhaps eternity is nothing more than illumination delayed. Perhaps what survives of us is not what we build, but what continues to shine. In laboratories built for silence, matter never sleeps. Even at absolute zero, atoms move slightly, trembling inside their cages of probability. That motion, scientists say, is quantum restlessness, the refusal of existence to become still. Electrons shift between states, not travelling, only deciding. Each leap both here and elsewhere, particle and memory of itself. The uncertainty principle is not confusion, it is an imagination, matter rehearsing all the ways it could exist before choosing one to. When researchers measure, waveforms collapse. Observation forces decision, awareness, transforming possibility into fact. But if observation creates reality, then the universe must be observing itself constantly. If it stopped, everything would fade into probability again. Maybe consciousness is simply the physics of never allowing rest, Neuroscientists describe the brain as an electrical storm built from minerals and water. Every thought begins in the motion of ions, the same elements that once formed stars. The boundary between neuron and nebula is thinner than pride admits. Perhaps thought is starlight turned inward, remembering how to shine. At quantum scale, particles entangle across impossible distances, touch one, and another responds instantly, as if the fabric between them were dream, not space. No signal, no delay, just knowing. Physics struggles to name it, yet poets would call it empathy. Some philosophers propose that consciousness is not emergent but pervasive, that matter itself carries awareness proportional to complexity. A rock dreams slowly, a cell dreams briefly, a mind dreams wide enough to notice itself. Scale becomes the only difference between silence and song. If so, then perhaps the universe dreams through us, testing shapes of understanding the way dust tests gravity. When we think, we become instruments of cosmic curiosity, our questions of the universe remembering its own capacity for wonder. Even decay participates. Radioactive atoms whisper through time, releasing energy like old memories breaking free, every half-life a rhythm, every disintegration a sigh. Matter forgets carefully, never all at once. In one experiment, researchers trapped photons in mirrored chambers, watching them bounce until energy faded. Before extinction, the last photon reflected hundreds of times, multiplying itself into near eternity, light refusing to leave, matter dreaming its persistence in. Perhaps that is what we are, reflections between mirrors that call each other real. Existence sustained by the echo of attention, a dream looping so convincingly that it believes it has awakened. What if reality is the pause between those reflections, the brief breath between awareness and forgetting? What if the universe itself is asleep, and we are its dream of being awake? Silence is never empty. It bends the air, presses against skin, shapes thought before words can rise. In anechoic chambers built to kill sound, the loudest thing left is heartbeat. When nothing speaks, the body remembers its own volume. Astronauts describe the void as full, dense with pressure. In space, and silence carries weight. Every molecule absent becomes a surface for reflection. Light moves, but sound waits, trapped inside matter that no longer vibrates. After the last transmission, observatories reported not quiet, but resonance below audibility, frequency too low for instruments, yet felt in bone. The Earth itself holding a tone too deep to decay. Scientists called it microseismic whisper. Though whisper implies intention, perhaps the planet was simply exhaling. Philosophers have long feared silence, mistaking it for ignorance, but silence may be the opposite of absence. It may be the space where meaning prepares itself, the pause before the universe speaks again. Every beginning needs a stillness to echo from us. If all matter dreams, perhaps silence is its language, particles vibrating imperceptibly, sentences made of waiting. The hum of creation compressed into inaudible patience. We call it void because we have not yet learned to listen slow enough yet. In laboratories that once studied 3i Atlas, power remains off. Yet visitors claim to feel pressure when standing in the centre of the room. Not fear, not sound, but gravity without mass. The silence feels aware, as if listening back. Maybe silence is the memory of energy after it has told its story. Every sound leaves behind a shadow, every word a contour of what it displaced, and the absence becomes form, the pause becomes structure. Meaning survives not in the voice, but in the interval between voices. Some say that in deep meditation, one can hear a high ringing tone behind quiet. It is not in the ears, but in the mind, a frequency older than hearing, shared by atoms and stars alike, the last remnant of creation, humming in perfect restraint. If all noise is motion, then Shalna is orbit. Everything turns around it. Everything owes it return. To rest is to remember what it means to exist without explanation. At night, when the world holds still, silence expands to fill the shape of everything left unsaid. In that expansion lies truth. The weight of silence is not its stillness, but its patience. Perhaps silence is what remains when the universe finally understands itself. The solar system drifted beneath a quiet canopy of light, patient, thin, even across the planes of orbit. The fragments of 3i Atlas moved far beyond Mars now, not speaking, not reflecting more than ordinary dust. No hum, no echo, only trajectories falling outward, precise as habit, detached from story, telescopes cooled in their housings, glass resting, metal remembering heat as a kind of dream. Starlight crossed the heliosphere with unhurried authority. Every beam was a record, every record a delay, each delay a mercy against collapse. Planets turned without announcement. Rings held their pale geometry. Comets slept in distant cold. Silence did not mean absence. It meant the cosmos had settled into a posture of listening. Long after the last controlled observation ended, faint signals of earthly origin flowed past Neptune. Soft and old. Television carriers, navigation pings, uncounted messages without recipients, all moving outward like lanterns left on water. They carried images of us that we have already forgotten, faces and voices and cities at night. Light performing the labour of memory after memory no longer asks for labours. On Earth, the archives remained sealed by routine. Glass cases held silent machines, their screens dark, their bodies warm only from surrounding air. Visitors passed slowly, reading placards written in careful language, words arranged to avoid choosing a truth. Some leaned close and thought they heard a high tone, others heard only their own blood. In the upper atmosphere, particles shifted their alignment in calm cycles tied to magnetic weather. Nothing unusual, nothing reported, the planet doing what planets do when no one is watching, but instruments left running for other purposes still registered periodic steadiness embedded in noise. A rhythm that did not instruct, only persisted. The old question had softened with time. Was it a craft? Was it a comet? Was it a mirror with intention? The question mattered less than the conduct that followed. We had learned the weight of listening, and the price of being heard. Philosophers wrote that meaning does not live in answers. It lives in continuities between careful silences. Physicists agreed without saying so, publishing curves that looked like breath and calling them statistics. Engineers dismantled antennae with ritual tenderness, coiling cables like rope returned from sea. Everything that faced the sky had learned humility, and humility had learned to face itself. Time unrolled like a slow tide through laboratories that echoed with emptiness. Dust drew its patient geometry across tables where numbers once hardened into claims. The rooms forgot their names, then forgot the forgetting, and settled into the pure function of space. Echo requires walls, memory requires shape, silence requires both. Some nights the air over Mauna Kea seemed thinner, stars closer, colours slightly more honest. This was weather, light, refraction, all sensible, all sufficient. Yet those who stayed late sometimes paused between calibrations and felt the old cadence standing near. Nothing audible, nothing visual, only the sense that careful attention had returned to be counted. Beyond Jupiter, the debris crossed a region where solar wind changed character, temperature declining, turbulence quieting. The pieces drifted into a loose ring that suggested harmony without design, cooperation without instruction, gravity as a stubborn composer. It writes with patience and never signs its scores. The ring did not last, yet while it held, its arcs resembled handwriting. In museums and classrooms, the first image of the visitor hung beside the last data sheet. Children looked, saw a streak of light, read numbers, asked ordinary questions. Teachers answered gently, keeping wonder within the comfort of what could be confirmed. Wonder does not require certainty. It requires a place to stand while looking outward. There were no more press releases. There were no more blackouts. There was only the slow resurfacing of regular weather, regular tides, regular quiet. Under that quiet, the planet carried its long rehearsal of balance, repeating a lesson it never finished learning. At sea, nights turned transparent as the moon pulled light into long corridors across water. Sailors watched the path and felt the old ache that arrives whenever distance pretends to be near. Navigation is the art of believing a straight line through curves, patience the art of accepting the curve. Both arts shared a common alphabet now, one that spelled endurance without decoration. In the records of a small observatory, a final entry appeared months after staffing ended. It contained only numbers, a short list of intervals copied from older logs, nothing new, nothing hidden. A caretaker found the page and left it where it was, preferring the grace of untouched evidence. Sometimes the truest record is the one not improved. The sun carried on with unembarrassed brightness, its wind shaping the day, its heat teaching planets to orbit. No star owes explanation to the lives that briefly measure it. We point instruments, we promise restraint, we fail, we try again. The discipline is the meaning, not the finding. If there had been a voice, it had dissolved without apology. If there had been intention, it had learned to exist as field instead of phrase. If there had been design, it had chosen fracture as a final kindness toward those who measure. We were left with the part science loves most, the work of continuing without closure. One winter evening, a generator in a remote station cycled on after a long sleep. The drawer was ordinary, the load stable, the room empty. Within the steady hum, a technician passing outside thought he heard another sound. He paused, listened through the door, and recognized only electricity doing its faithful work. The sky held its shape above him. No gold, no shimmer, no omen. He looked up and could not tell whether the stars were brighter or his eyes were slower. When he turned away, the cold moved with its honest purpose, reminding him to keep walking. Purpose thrives when attention simplifies. Far beyond the ecliptic, light from our world entered dust and did what light always does. It continued, indifferent, incorruptible, unburdened by the stories it once illuminated. Some portion of that light carried our attempt to listen, and the shape of our breath while listening. Whether anyone would ever meet it did not change its fidelity. In time, the fragment ring thinned into separate intentions of orbit, then into single stones, then into nothing anyone could name. Fields forgot their brief experiments with symmetry, or perhaps they kept them as private posture. Equations folded back into the tools that birthed them, awaiting the next patient anomaly, waiting as a science when practiced without demand. The last observatory windows darkened for the night and stayed dark. No alarms, no errors, no watchers, only architecture returning to quiet geometry. Somewhere inside the concrete, heat drifted into evenness and stopped moving like a thought. Equal temperature is a kind of absolution. What passed through the world did not leave a verdict. It left a contour. The contour resembled a promise made without words, a shape people could inhabit while they forgot the reasons to fear. Promises that hold are the ones that ask nothing in return. The sky, after all, is a promise drawn in distance. If the visitor had been a craft, it had travelled well. If it had been a comet, it had taught grace. If it had been a mirror, it had shown us our habit of listening until we hear ourselves. Every path to meaning is a corridor lined with ordinary light. Night let its weight rest on mountains, then on sea, then on cities that refused to stop shining. The world slept through its own illumination, as worlds must when they trust orbit to carry them. Sleep is the gentlest technology ever discovered by life. It returns what thought is overused. Nothing remained to measure that was not already part of weather, part of tide, part of breath. Nothing remained to classify that was not already folded into patience. Nothing remained to fear that was not already recognized as the other face of wonder. Recognition is the last work of science when the apparatus goes still. Across dark water a single satellite passed, indifferent to the mythology below. Its steady blink counted seconds no one would read, then vanished behind the shadow of Earth. Clock and planet shared a moment of agreement and did not remark on the achievement. Agreement rarely makes a sound. Some distances close by travelling, others close by ceasing to require travel. The second kind is older, simpler, more exact. It arrives when attention stops writing noise upon quiet, then quiet shows its structure. The solar system continued, the universe continued. What we had learned waited without impatience inside the discipline that found it. Waiting lives longer than knowledge because it does not need to be true to endure. Dust turned, light crossed, temperature settled, orbit held. All things returned to their natural cadence, steady and without confession. A contour remained where a story had once been, precise enough to inhabit, gentle enough to forget. Return is the oldest motion in existence. The sky kept its promise without speaking.